So, well, thank you for a very insightful and wide-ranging lecture. We'll open it up to the floor in a minute, but let me abuse the privilege of the session chair to ask you one question. You highlighted the importance of cultural similarity for Europe by drawing an analogy between political integration and marriage. And you said you better agree on things if you're actually going to spend your life together. And I noted that all your data stops in 2008. Now, we've had a bit of a crisis afterwards, and to stay with the metaphor, it's a little bit like saying, you know, yes, I can go on vacation with this person and have a terribly good time while the pina coladas are coming and the sun is shining, but you really only know whether a relationship works once you're sitting in that basement with the rats running around and going hungry. And that's where I sort of want to go. It's very easy to get on if times are good. But what do we know, or what is your conjecture the data would show once there's conflict, crisis, and hardship? And the images you showed motivating your talk about from Greece and from Germany are actually from a time of crisis. And if you'd asked Germans and Greeks what they think of each other in 2007, they would have probably been very warm. But 2011, all of this went out of the window at a speed that shocked many of us. So do you have any thoughts on this?
You're right. So let me give you two thoughts. First, I don't think that if we took these questions in 2016, the answers would be different, the cultural question. So I don't think that the crisis has made countries more different in these cultural traits. So these are fairly stable preferences that don't change so much. Nevertheless, as we see in political debates almost daily, nationalism has risen further. Not from the data I've shown, because they were taken in 2016, but the relevance is greater. So the crisis certainly had an impact of polarizing countries and creating animosity. But one can argue that this, to some extent, also reflects the state of policies and institutions in Europe. And one feature of the integration that has taken place in Europe is such that it has given among other things, it has given nation states often constraints in their ability to react to shocks or to common or to policy emergencies. So the perception, whether right or wrong, in the mind of citizens is that Europe is often responsible for making it harder to national policymakers to react to crisis. And I think this is part of the reason why you see this additional conflict, that Europe is perceived as reducing the ability of governments to cope with stress. Of course, this was the case in the Eurozone crisis. So let me give you a very specific example of this. We all tend to think that one feature of globalization and the feature of the technological improvement has been to increase polarization within countries, to increase inequality and increase the distance between those that benefit from progress and those that are left behind. Europe has done nothing to help countries cope with this problem, not only because it doesn't have a system of redistribution, but also because by opening up movements of capital across countries and facilitating capital flows, it has made it harder for governments to enact redistributive policies. It's more difficult for many countries, for instance, to tax wealth systematically, to redistribute because of tax competition. So there are small things that Europe could do without engaging in European redistribution to empower government policy to cope with these challenges. For instance, exchanging information about financial assets so that governments would find it easier to redistribute at home compared to the current situation. There are other examples that one can give, but I think, so my short answer to your question is you're right. Nationalism is clearly a consequence of crisis, but it's not obvious that this is the response that would always occur. It could be that sometime being in danger and in crisis unites people rather than divide people. Whether it divides people or unites people also has to do with the arrangements that you have between these partners. And the arrangements that we have in Europe now often have given the impression that rather than helping people to fight external dangers, they have made it harder for national governments to fight the emergency situation. And I think that's something that we ought to think harder about, in particular, without going to redistribution, in particular, to how can we exploit the power of European institutions and policies to make it easier for government to meet these challenges. And in some cases, we have been effective. In other cases, I think we have made things worse.
Okay, that's very interesting because it differs a little bit from my perception. My sense has been that one of the reasons why we've seen a revival of nationalist sentiment is that when the chips are down, we had the crisis, the one type of agent that was capable of jumping in and making a difference, stimulating demand, helping to stabilize employment, etc., was the nation state. And after emphasizing the importance of European policies, when you have to act quickly and decisively, the thing that we saw was not, as you emphasized, the Europeans restraining this, but the ability of countries to quickly agree on what matters and what doesn't, and actually implementing policies on the whole. And Europe, compared to that, at best, slowing things down and making them more complicated. But I don't think it's the slowdown effect from Europe. It's not restricting ability, but it's just this difference of agility at the national level that's brought home very vividly that who you're going to call? The nation state in a crisis and not Europe.
Yes, but I think the nation state, in some dimensions, directly or indirectly, had its hand more tied as a result of European integration in dealing with some of these emergencies. That's clearly the case in Southern Europe with regard to sovereign debt crisis, where in the past the central bank would have lent a hand, monetary policy would have lent a hand. But I think indirectly this aspect of tax competition that limits the ability of the state to redistribute and reduce the gap between those that benefit and those that are hurt, I think is also something important in my view that we as economists have neglected. I think there has been an important argument that tax competition is beneficial because it prevents governments from abusing its citizens, but the challenges of globalization are making it more and more clear that to overcome nationalism, the state also ought to think about those who are left behind, and I think tax competition is one important break that in Europe we have because of this.
Okay, very good. Let's open it up. We have time for a few questions. So, there's a question over here.
Bruno Frey from the University of Basel. That was a wonderful and really path-breaking research. Thank you very much. I have 2 points. On the basis of your empirical analysis, you, of course, focus on Europe. That was your topic. But I think we can look at a different aspect. Consider France, which you mentioned. The heterogeneity within France is almost or equally as large as between countries. So the conclusion would be decentralize France. That is the major thing to be done. Decentralized with respect to taxes, decentralized with respect to public expenditures. My second point, I think multi-speed Europe is better than same-speed Europe, but I don't think that this is a really economic reaction to the problem. I think the economic reaction should be to have functional integration with respect to economic issues. Thank you.
Shall I respond?
Yes, please, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Bruno. I think you are right in many ways with both of your questions, but let me elaborate a bit more, particularly on the first. I largely agree on the second, so I don't have anything to add to what you said. I agree on the multi-speed with regard to different functions. Although, maybe let me elaborate on this before I take the first question. Although perhaps often these functions could be correlated in a way that would create an inner circle and an outer circle of countries. Although the principle is right, I think the practical implication would be similar in my opinion. On the first point, you're right that decentralization is important, but there are two things that I want to emphasize. The first is that there are a number of policy challenges that are becoming more important that require unification, that increase the benefits of economies of scale. I'm thinking about foreign policy, migration, defense, environment, energy. In all of these dimensions, unless you operate on a bigger scale than the nation state, you're going to be left behind. So I think the world has changed in a way that makes these global dimensions more urgent and more important to be addressed. There are other dimensions in which maybe we should proceed on the dimension of decentralization. However, much of the heterogeneity that we observe within countries, I think, may be such that it's not so easy to operate on decentralization. It's an heterogeneity between urban centers and peripheries. Not necessarily, in the case of Italy, it's also between the north and the south. But in the case of other countries, it's much less obvious that you can divide the heterogeneity along geographic lines. And if you can, it is a heterogeneity between urban and center and periphery. And so there, this heterogeneity cannot be dealt with just by decentralization, I think.
All right, time for one more. Over here.
Good day, sir. I'm a student from the University of Zurich. My question is regarding your regression analysis. Specifically, have you asked the survey people as well about their perception of the difference between and within the countries? And if yes, how has this changed over time?
So I don't think there are questions of this kind in the surveys. So we have not conducted our own survey. We have exploited surveys that are published. And I don't remember such questions. There are questions that come close to what perhaps have in mind, that have to do with being proud of your national identity or your European identity. I'm sorry, I'm hesitating because I'm thinking about trust. So there are trust questions, how much you trust citizens of a specific country. Unfortunately, they were asked once only, so you cannot compare these trust questions over time. The proudness question that are there. As you see, as I told you, you become more proud of your nationality and equally proud of your European identity. On the bilateral trust, how much trust do you have in other countries? The question was asked, I think, at the beginning of the sample. And I know they have been used by other scholars, such as Guido, Sapienza, and Zingales, to relate them to trade. And what emerges from these data, not just on a European scale, but on a world scale, is that there is a very strong correlation between trust, bilateral trust, and trade. You trade more with countries that you trust more. Now, the direction of causality, of course, is ambiguous and can go both ways. I don't remember studying these data in particular for Europe. I imagine that there too you would find more trust in the countries that trade more with each other, but I haven't looked at Europe in particular.
So I'm afraid we're out of time. Thank you very much, Guido. Thank you all for the questions. And we will reconvene in half an hour at 11:15.